Hello, my name is Caroline Sanderson, and I'm Associate Editor of the Bookseller magazine, home of the British Book Awards. And it's my great honour and pleasure to be here talking to Bernardine Evaristo, winner of not one but two accolades at this year's awards, affectionately known as the Nibbies. She won Fiction Book of the Year for her novel Girl, Woman, Other, which of course also won the 2019 Booker Prize. And she was also crowned Author of the Year, which is just wonderful and, in my humble opinion, richly deserved. So, Bernardine, many congratulations. I do hope you've been able to party a little bit.
Yeah, we cracked open a bottle of bubbly last night, so that was pleasant. Yeah, it was fantastic, and obviously we didn't have the ceremony, so I've kind of missed out on that in a sense. But I still feel the buzz of it, because of social media. So it's been very exciting.
I'm really pleased you're able to have a drink at least. It
Mm.
has been an extraordinary 9 months or so for you, hasn't it? Because in addition to the two prizes that I've just mentioned, and the Booker, of course, Girl, Woman, Others riding high in the bestseller lists as well. Is it possible to describe what these last few months have felt like?
Yes, it has felt like riding high, but I've tried to stay very grounded at the same time, because I don't want to come down with a big thump in a few months' time. It's I've been writing for a long time, and it feels like I've really come out of the shadows since October. In fact, since I was on the Booker shortlist. And I love the fact that my book is getting out there to a wide readership. To me, that is the biggest, the most gratifying thing that's happened since winning the Booker. My book is out there and it's being read by many people. And as a writer, it's really important to communicate. I would imagine that's why most of us write. So if you're only communicating to a few people, then there's always a sense of frustration. And that has been my history as a writer. So to suddenly be communicating to so many people that I hit the top of the bestseller list it's just incredible. And also I'm the same person, obviously, I'm the same writer, but I am being treated differently. And that literally happened overnight with winning the Booker. And I find that quite funny, to be honest, because same person, nothing else has changed other than the fact that I won the Booker. And suddenly I have been given this status that I didn't have before.
Mm. Now, no, you said in your Nibby's acceptance speech, you mentioned that it was all worth waiting 40 years for, I think you said. So I really wanted to take a look back because I'd love people watching to know more about your other books if they haven't read them. I mean, if Girl, Woman, Other is the sort of first time that they've come across your work. So I wanted to start off with a bit of show-offy fangirling and out myself a bit because this is my much loved proof copy of The Emperor's Babe, which came out in 2001. And I was just rereading bits of it last night. It's a story of the fortunes of a Sudanese girl living in Roman Britain. And it reminded me just how vibrant and sort of unconventional and subversive your writing has always been, both in form and content. I mean, for example, to my shame, I didn't even know that there'd been an African emperor. And that's just an example of what reading your work has taught me, I think. And it also reminded me that your roots lie very firmly in poetry and possibly in performance too. Your first book, The Island of Abraham, is a poetry collection. Your second, Lara, a verse novel. And you've also got a drama training. So take us back to the roots of your writing.
Yes, I began writing when I was at drama school. I was training to be an actor, but I was on a course that was called a community theatre arts course, and it was for actors who wanted to create community theatre. It was at Rose Bruford College of Speech and Drama, and that was where I began writing because we were there to create theatre as well as act. And so I started creating theatre. And I came from a very kind of white background in terms of where I grew up, the school I went to, even the youth theatre I went to. So I went to drama school and suddenly encountered four other black women. And that was quite revolutionary for me. And we got together and started talking about being black women. And this is in 1979, 80, 80 81, 82, and started writing from our experiences of being black women. And my work always came out as poetry. So I was writing for theatre and also performing my work, and it always came out as poetry because I'd always loved poetry, I guess. And I also grew up in the Catholic Church, and I think that was an influence, the language of the Catholic Church, which was said in Latin when I was a child. And so that was the beginning. And then I formed a theatre company, Theatre Black Women, with two other women from drama school, Paulette Randall, Patricia St. Hilaire, and then ran that company throughout the 80s, and then left theatre behind, and then just focused on writing poetry, and then published my first poetry book in 94 with People Tree Press, and it was called Island of Abraham. And I rarely sort of talk about that book because I feel, even by the time it was published, I felt disassociated from it because I don't think that I'd really found my voice as a writer. I was trying to write, even though I was writing along Afro-diasporic themes, I was trying to write a style of poetry that I thought how you should write poetry. So it was quite safe and tame, and I just don't think I'd found my voice at all. And then my second book, Lara, was a verse novel, as you mentioned. And that was the book about my family history, and it spanned 150 years and 7 generations and various parts of the world, and also looked at my experience of growing up in the UK. And that was written as a prose novel originally for 3 years because I was trying to write what I thought was a traditional novel, and then turned it into poetry and spent 2 years working on its poetry, and it became the book that it is, which is a novel in verse. And then The Emperor's Babe was my sort of first little breakthrough book, if you like, because I'd been with very small publishers at the beginning, and then I went with Hamish Hamilton Penguin, and I've been with them ever since, and they published The Emperor's Babe. And that began life as a few poems based on a residency I had at the Museum of London, which was to write poems about London's history. And I wanted to write about the black presence in London. And my character, as you say, Zuleika, is a black girl who grows up in Roman London. So I was then trying to bring that history alive, you know, the sort of very deep ancient history of Britain alive, because we're going back now 1800 years. And the truth of that book is that it wasn't going to be a novel, but I met my editor at somebody's book launch at a club in West London, and I said, I'm working on a verse novel about a black girl growing up in Roman London. And he saw it, and I'd only written a few poems. I put them together, I created a synopsis and sold it as a novel in verse, and he eventually bought it, and it was published. And I feel very proud of that because I was just being very resourceful, because I don't think any of the sort of mainstream fiction publishers would have picked up a verse novel about a black Roman London girl 20 years ago. In fact, I don't think they would have done it. But somehow Simon bought the book. And as I keep saying, you know, I've been with him ever since. And then my next book was Soul Tourists, which is the one nobody talks about. And it's about a black couple who travel across Europe by car. And it's about their relationship, but it's also about black ghosts from European history, going back to Hannibal of Carthage 2,500 years ago. And they come into the life of the young man as they're taking this road trip across Europe. And it's very experimental. It's poetry, it's prose, script. Some of it prose poetry. Some of it doesn't look like a novel at all. Kind of experimental forms, and it's pretty wild in form. And I kind of think, well, maybe it's not the sum of its parts because very few people ever mention it. The next book, Blonde Roots, just going quickly through. Blonde Roots is a book about the transatlantic. Oh, there it is. A book about the transatlantic slave trade. And I wanted to write about that slave trade. And a lot of writers do at some point want to write about slavery because it's about 400 years of, you know, British history, actually. And, you know, when I say slave, I mean the transatlantic slave trade, because there have been many other slave trades and it still exists today. And I thought, how can I do this in a way that's going to do something different with it and help people look at the trade differently? And so I created a world where Africans enslaved European, and created this satire where I just turn everything on its head and really mess with people's minds, actually. And I think it's quite hardcore satire. And what I find quite interesting is that people are reading that book now, and I kind of wonder what they think, having gone from Girl, Woman, Other to this really savage satire, because it is so different in every way possible, I think, to Girl, Woman, Other. And it's
Well,
about one woman. Sorry.
yeah, no, I was just going to say, but I think just hearing you talk there about, I just wanted to interject when you just talked about the Emperor's Babe and Blonde Roots, because they just hearing you talk about them, that's so timely. I mean, the epigraph to the Emperor's Babe is an Oscar Wilde quote: "The one duty we owe to history is to rewrite it." And of course, that's exactly what you do in Blonde Roots. And I mean, how topical is that? I mean, both were
Yeah.
published over a decade ago.
Yes, a long time ago. And actually, one of the great things, and I should have said that earlier about winning the Booker, is that people are revisiting my backlist. And some of those books, I think, have a particular resonance right now in this particular political moment. So that is really exciting, that people are going to engage work that I wrote quite a long time ago. In fact, 20 years or even more than 20 years. I actually started Lara, which is also about multiracial Britain and my mixed race heritage. I started writing that in 1991 or 1990. So it's 30 years ago. And I hope that the books will sort of resonate with people today. And I expect that they kind of will. So then Blonde Roots was that book. And then my next book was 2010. And that was Hello Mum, which was one of these quick reads, these sort of novellas, very slim novellas for people to read quickly. And it was about a boy growing up in a housing estate, and he gets into trouble. And I wanted to get inside the head of a child who we hear about in the media, but we never hear what they've got to say. So I did a lot of research and then wrote this book about this boy called Jerome and about his life in his words, so to speak. And then the next book was Mr. Loverman, which is 2013. And that was about a gay Caribbean London man at the age of... Yeah, there it is, new cover. I love the new cover.
I have to confess that this is one that I have only just read. I hadn't got to it before, and I mean, I'd love to talk about this one for a minute, because in 2013, wonderful novel about a gay black man, Barry Walker, who's 74 years old and has spent the last 60 years in a relationship with his best friend Morris. And I love that somewhere you call this novel triple niche.
Yes, well, I didn't. The industry did. The industry called it triple niche because it's a black character, older and gay, and it was like, well, that's just, let's put that in that little box there. So Mr. Loverman, I think it's probably the most. I'm not really a commercial writer, although what does that even mean these days? Because if you become a bestseller, you are a commercial writer. But it was a very popular novel for me. And it is about this man and his relationship, and he's married and he's a father and grandfather, and he is, to some extent, a comic character. And through that book, I just wanted to explore homosexuality, and the character came to me through an exercise, and he just wrote himself, as far as I'm concerned. So that was the last book, and then Go Woman Other, which I think all my books answer, sort of respond to the one that's gone before. And I think Mr. Loverman was responding to Hello Mum, which was the book about the 14-year-old boy. And actually, the 14-year-old boy in Hello Mum appears, was mentioned in Mr. Loverman. So you've got a 14-year-old boy, then you've got a 74-year-old man. So you've got two ends of the age spectrum. And then you've got Go Woman Other, which is where the women take centre stage, because I'd written two books really where the protagonists were primarily male. Even though Barrington and Mr. Loverman, his wife, has her own sections, she's still a secondary figure. And then suddenly it's like, God, what are you doing? Just get these women's stories out there. And that's what I did.
Yeah, and I mean, reading Mr. Loverman, it reminded me what a funny writer you are, and how you use humour so wonderfully well. As you mentioned, Mr. Loverman, Barry's wife there, Carmel. I mean, there's a wonderful scene in Mr. Loverman where she brings all her friends home from church, and I laughed and I laughed. And, for a while, she's kind of almost the baddie, but then you also make us feel her tragedy too. So you're using the humour too to sort of subvert what you're writing about.
Yeah, I think so. Humour is a strong theme throughout all my work, and It was never intentional, to be honest, and I don't know. I'm asked about it, and I try and come up with a reason and try to understand my own practice. But truthfully, I find it quite hard to deconstruct my own sense of humour and how it manifests in my writing. And I don't think in real life I'm a particularly funny person, actually. But somehow in my writing, if it's not there, I feel that the work isn't coming alive. And I think it
Right.
functions in different ways.
Yeah, it's so interesting. And I mean, having talked about your early works and these sort of, and the way that you use verse and these sort of verse novels, and then you come to Girl, Woman, Other, and you have this sort of almost stream of consciousness way of putting us inside the heads of your 12 female characters. Which I think works wonderfully well, and is very distinctive. And I read that you'd referred to your style as fusion fiction as well, and I wondered if you could maybe talk about what you meant by that.
I was trying to come up with a term to describe what I'd done with the novel, because by the time I'd finished it, I don't write traditional novels anyway, really, and I just thought, what have I done? What is this? And I thought, well, I don't know, it just plucked it out of the air. I thought, what about fusion fiction? I don't think it really exists as a term, but it seemed really appropriate for this book because I don't use many full stops, so it's grammatically unorthodox, and I don't use many capitals. And I have what I call a pro-poetic patterning on the page, so it kind of, the shape of the text on the page looks a bit like poetry, but I don't really see it as poetry, or at least I didn't intend it as poetry. And because I write it in this experimental form, the characters, I think it does create that stream of consciousness, flowing character, because it is a very flowing form and a very flowing process to write. And it's like you're just swimming in the character's consciousnesses. And also because all those 12 women, their stories are interlinked, it helps you swim into everyone's lives in a sense, because you're in one character, and maybe if you're going with the book, you're in this sort of dreamlike state where you're in their lives and you're deep inside the characters, and then you're in the next one, and then you're in the next one, and then you're in the next one. And I don't think it would work if I'd written it as a traditional novel. I think it would have been way too limiting and restricting. And I think the 12 narratives, because they are 12 narratives separately told but all interlinked, would read probably more like short stories. And I wouldn't have been able to capture a woman's life in 30 pages, which is what I do, in the way that I do, if I had written it in traditional prose. And the book has been reviewed all over the place, and every critic has a different sort of interpretation of how that fusion works, and they teach me about it as well, which is really interesting.
That is interesting. We were talking a bit earlier about your editor at Hamish Hamilton, Simon Prosser, and when you're talking about the unconventional nature of the way you write, the way you've always written, what has the continuity of having him as your editor over that time done for your work?
Absolutely. I think I said I probably wouldn't have written this book without him. And I think that could be true, because he's published every one of my books. The only book two of my first books he didn't publish, and one book I republished, and Blood Axe book, published that, and that's Lara, because I actually added a third new material to that book. But everything, so he's published 6 books with me in the last 20 years. And first of all, Simon is a literary editor, and he likes his writers to do their own thing. If you think about the authors on his list, Deborah Levy, Ali Smith, Marlon James, Zadie Smith, the range of his authors, Arundhati Roy, everybody has their own very distinct voice. And so as a writer, I have never felt that I should be writing more conventional fiction with him. I have never felt that I shouldn't be writing from the subject matter, that around the subject matter that I do and in the way that I do. Because I think for all its humor and its experiment and the rest of it, my work is very seriously underpinned by some very weighty issues. And something like Blonde Roots, for example, which I said is like hardcore satire, I think it's very hard-hitting around race. And then other books, Mr. Loverman is a really sort of a very sort of what do you call it? I don't know, penetrating exploration of homosexuality in a Caribbean community. So all these things are things that I've been able to explore because Simon has always published my work, and I've also been able to grow as a writer. So I began with him with the very kind of exuberant and lively The Emperor's Babe, and then moved on through all these different books, exploring all these different genres and experimenting and trying to find interesting ways to discuss some of these big, important issues until we get to Go Woman Other and hopefully continue beyond. So I think it's so important. And he's also a really strict editor. I'm not the kind of writer who I think can just publish something that I've just written and not given to my editors to read and to get feedback on. I get very good, very thorough feedback from Simon and his editors before a book is published. And there's only one book where there wasn't really any feedback, and that was Hello Mum, which was the very, very slim novella, because they just thought it was good to go. But my other books, I need editorial intervention. And I get that from that publishing house. And I know a lot of writers don't get it. And I would hope that this will continue. And I will say to him with the next book, just do what you normally do. Don't think somehow that you've got to treat me carefully because I'm the booker. I think it's the beginning of the end. And sometimes you can see that in someone's work when they don't have there's no more editorial control because they just, the writer doesn't want it, or they know that the readers are going to buy the book anyway.
Now, you paid tribute to Simon, who I should say was shortlisted for Editor of the Year at British Book Awards. And you paid tribute to him on Twitter, and this is sort of opens out the discussion in a way. You said, you mentioned his track record of publishing diverse voices and writers of colour, and you've mentioned some of them: Marlon James, Arundhati Roy, Zadie Smith, Hossein Hamed. And you tweeted, so why do some editors explain our absence from their lists by saying we're not good enough? Now, I interview a lot of writers, and I so look forward to the day when I interview a Black writer and neither of us feels we need to talk about these things. But given the times we're in, it would be an omission if I didn't. And I think your track record of activism and advocacy on behalf of other writers, and in particular writers of colour, is remarkable. I mean, to pick out just a few of the things that you've done: you were co-founder of the Theatre of Black Women in 1982, founding director of literature development agency Spread the Word in 1995, founder of the Complete Works, a decade-long mentoring programme for poets of colour, in 2007, and founder of the Brunel International African Poetry Prize in 2012. It all reminds us that you've been grappling with all these issues for too long now, really.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And it can be tiring, but it is something that I've chosen to take it on. I've chosen to do that battle. And I come from a socialist background. I believe in egalitarianism. I believe in equality. And as my career has developed and I have had platforms, I've been able to make these interventions. It's just that the industry hasn't really responded much. Although, and it's good to talk to you about this because I usually talk about this sort of in the media, like on the radio or television, and I don't get a chance to really talk at length about my thoughts about it. I just have to deliver sound bites, really. So the thing about the Complete Works mentoring scheme, which came out of a report called Free Verse that I initiated in 2004, which the Arts Council funded and Spread the Word produced, which discovered that under 1% of poetry books in the UK were by poets of colour. So then I did the Complete Works mentoring scheme, which I initiated, and somebody called Dr. Natalie Teichler ran it for 10 years. And I have to shout out to Natalie because she's amazing. And she just, organised this 10-year mentoring scheme on which 30 poets of colour were taken. And it was funded by the Arts Council. And those 30 poets were mentored by many of Britain's leading poets, and there were all kinds of other activities available for them. And they were all people at a level where they could really benefit from it, but they were already writing. One or two had already published one book each. And by the end of the scheme, 2017, the poets have just gone out there into the world and done incredibly well, publishing books. They've hoovered up every prize going in this country, and it continues. Roger Robinson, who won the T.S. Eliot Prize, was one of the mentees on the first scheme. What was it, 14 years ago or so? No, 30, I can't add up. Anyway, 2008 or so. He'd already published one book, but so many of these poets have gone out there into the world. So on the one hand, you have these diversity initiatives, and the Complete Works was one of them, and such a successful one. And then you have the industry as a whole, and how the industry as a whole can improve its performance. And the diversity initiatives, I don't think are good enough anymore, because I think the industry knows what needs to happen, and people in the industry need to put their heads together and work out how they can become more inclusive. Because writers of colour, people of colour in the industry have done all the talking around this. Now, I know there are exceptions. Penguin, my publisher, has had and still has the Right Now scheme, which has brought in a number of writers and has been seriously looking at the sort of demographic of the workforce. We've got Hachette, dialogue books, bringing in the phenomenal Charmaine Lovegrove to run dialogue books. And you've got Murky Books again at Penguin. And then you have got some Black-led publishers, Jacaranda, Cassava Republic, Flip Die, Poetry. So I have to talk very generally when I talk about this. The industry can see we're not there. And it isn't just Black people, but that's what I'm going to talk about now. They can see we're not there, so they need to decide through consultation how to redress the balance, how to bring people into the workforce, how to change their staffing demographic. And it's such a big problem in a sense, because if an institution is 93%, 95% run by white middle class people, then bringing people of colour in and say, I think Black people are not doing as well as people from Asian people. Bringing people of colour in is not enough if you're only going to bring in one person. That is a token gesture. And that one person can only do so much if they are always the lone voice in the room, trying to get people to see things from another perspective. And then there is the range of books that need to be published. And that's anything from cookery books to literary fiction, crime, thriller, romance, memoir, self-help books, every genre imaginable. And that does not mean that, for example, writers of colour are going to be writing about race, but they need to be in those conversations, and those books need to be published. And the groundwork needs to be done now to bring people in. And so we have to look at the agents as well. And that's one of the things that the latest report, which of course the bookseller has produced, and with Spread the Word and Goldsmiths, and the bookseller has been behind these reports for a long time, I have to say, because the bookseller, I think, has been a powerful force for good in this conversation. I think the first report actually came out of the bookseller in full colour, I think it was. So now I've lost my track. So what was I saying?
Well, I was going to actually quote you. You were saying many very important things. I was actually going to quote something back at you that you wrote, because I think it's absolutely right for now, because we have to ensure that this is not a fad right now, because we've got books by writers of colour, Renee Edo-Lodge, Britt Bennett, who you've been a great advocate for, her novel, which I'm about to read, Candice Carty-Williams, of course, Layla Saad. We have to ensure this is not just a fad, at the moment. And I was going to mention that you're a great contributor to many excellent anthologies, Refugee Tales, published by the wonderful Comma Press in Manchester, New Daughters of Africa, edited by Margaret Busby and published by Myriad Editions, and Brave New Worlds, also published by Myriad. And in this current context, I was incredibly struck by a sentence in your essay in Brave New Words, which just seems to me to encapsulate what you've just been saying. You write, the plethora of books currently being published is astonishing considering the history of uninterest. But we must be wary, because today's boom is not the result of a steady incremental transition from marginalisation towards the publication and celebration of books in all genres over many decades, it has exploded out of a void. So, I mean, that sent shivers up my spine, because it seemed to me to be saying, right, it's all very well for us to be having this conversation, but, people's attention wanes and, we go on to something else. So it's just so important that this is embedded, isn't it? For once and for all.
Right. That's right. And, that explosion happened about 2 years ago, I would say. And now we're going to get a new explosion, clearly, because so many books are doing well right now, in the wake of Black Lives Matter. But I think when I wrote that essay, which was, I wrote it last summer for the anthology, I think even though there are so many more books out there at the moment that I was referring to, a lot of those books are non-fiction books. And even though there are more than before, there still aren't enough. Do you see? Because we've had almost no books out there, especially in certain genres like non-fiction, to me, it was like this, this wonderful, feast of abundant literature, and it's fantastic. But actually, I think if we start to look at the numbers, it is still not enough. And then if you look at fiction by Black British writers, how many novelists are publishing at the moment? How many new novelists are coming through? The ones that are coming through are doing really well. Candice is doing really well. Sarah Collins is doing really well. Who else is coming through? So, and poetry, I think, is bubbling away underneath the surface. And we know that some of the poetry publishers, I've had a argy-bargy with some of the poetry editors for many years, because they have resolutely refused to diversify. Whereas the publishing industry right now is saying, okay, look, we know there's a problem. We're going to do an audit. We're going to find out what the problem is, and we're going to deal with it. The poetry world has historically been so resolutely resistant to diversifying, because they've always said, well, it's about the quality of the work, and not acknowledged actually it's also about personal taste, and how is that personal taste constructed. And also a lot of poetry presses, they don't have the same kind of an economic imperative as the big publishing houses, so they can get away with not publishing writers of colour, and it doesn't matter whether their books sell or not. So they can publish these very esoteric texts that 10 people will read and nobody cares about it. Whereas actually the best-selling poets who are publishing are right now poets of colour. So it's a very complicated and nuanced thing, I would say, but it's exciting time. It's very exciting. So is it going to last? Well, we've got the Black Writers Guilds, which has just been formed, and I think that will be a powerful force. If you look at all the names on there, and run by a couple of powerhouses, Afua Hirsch and Charmaine Lovegrove and Nels Abbey, who I haven't actually met him, so I don't know him. But there's actually now a guild, and I think other organisations are going to come through, and these organisations will hold the industry to account. I think we will definitely see a second wave of publications coming from writers of colour, and also especially Black writers, simply because a quarter of the books in the bestseller list, as I speak, are by writers of colour. And two of us are holding the top spots. So there's such an economic argument for that, and the industry can't ignore it. And the other thing to say is, it is about publishing interesting work, important work in every kind of genre of quality. But it's also about saying these books add value in all kinds of ways, and that we're not asking for charity. They shouldn't see it as a philanthropic exercise. How do you sell the works by people of colour and make it economically advantageous? Look at Oyinkan Braithwaite, My Sister the Serial Killer. I mean, she is almost an exception in terms of her genre, crime fiction, and it's set in Nigeria. She's not the only one, but there aren't many at all. But that has been a wonderful bestseller and an award winner and very successful.
Winner at the British Book Awards, which is
absolutely.
It's tremendous, and I'm so struck because yes, absolutely, there's an economic argument, but let's let's go back just going back to Girl, Woman, Other, and I sort of feel like it's appropriate to sort of finish this interview coming back to your award-winning book. I read in an interview that you gave after winning the Booker for this novel that you found the character of Grace, born in 1895, particularly challenging to write. And you said something like, it was really hard for me to imagine what her life was like. And it seems to me that, this encapsulates something about the need to be able to imagine what other people's lives are like. It's what writers are for, and really, and that's why we need to hear from diverse voices more than ever right now. You would agree with that, I'm sure.
Absolutely. If you're not present in the literature and you're kind of marginalized anyway in society, then you're completely invalidated. And so one of the things that I think about Girl, Woman, Other is that people are encountering not one or two Black British women, but women, because one is non-binary, but 12 women of color in a single text. And people have, even though I don't write to educate, and that's another issue, but people have said they found it really enlightening, and that suddenly they've come across all these characters as if they're really, they are real people, and just learned so much about communities that they don't really engage with. And we know that that's one of the things about literature. One of the great things about literature is that you get to step inside someone else's life, someone else's shoes, and experience their experiences. And so that's one of the ways in which literature can bridge some of the, the distances or perceived barriers between people. And so it's a force for good in the world. And that's one of the reasons why it's so important that our books are out there in every way possible.
Yeah. Now, you have a tremendous statement on your excellent website. I really recommend your website as a place to go if people want to find out more about your work, all of your work. It says, writing is an adventure, a journey into the unknown. I enjoy liberating myself from the shackles of convention. Now, I'm guessing that's not going to change just because we're all talking about you right now.
It's not. I think probably I've got even more freedom than before, to be honest. I'm not really worried about the next book because I just have to be really pragmatic. I'm going to write it, and it's going to be the book I want to write, because if it's not written from the heart, then I can't write it. It's just not going to work. So with every one of my books, I have to write the book that is in me to write, and then it will land where it lands. And if people enjoy it as much as this one, that would be incredible. And if they don't, well, they enjoyed this one, so that was great. And I'll just move on to the next book. And experimentation is in my genes. I can't not experiment in some way. So it's exciting. I'm going to start a new book next year. And when I stop doing all this press stuff and sort of and the sort of virtual festivals and so on, and see what happens.
Fantastic. Well, many congratulations again, and thank you so much for talking to us.
Thank you.